Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT patch rundown video. Today we'll be diving into the newest patch 1020 and all the changes that come with it. Set 4 has been a blast so far with a diverse meta that's relatively well balanced, but there have been a few champions and synergies that have been performing a bit too well. In general, the balance philosophy for Set 4 is smaller nudges to prevent wide swings in the meta, so expect a lot of what was viable to remain so moving forward. With all that said, let's dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. We've got a lot of small changes to cover today, so we'll be focusing on the most relevant ones that will affect the game. To begin, there's a few system changes to talk about before we get into the meat and potatoes of the patch with traits and champions. First up is a quality of life change that we want to highlight, as there's now going to be more stats in the combat recap panel. Along with current damage stats, it will now also show total damage blocked, shields, and healing. Sure, this doesn't affect balance at all, but we appreciate them adding more stats to track just to see how well your champions are doing. A larger system change is to the drop chance of 4-cost champions at level 8. They are lowering the chance of finding a 4-cost at level 8 to 20% from 25%. To compensate, they've added the 5% to the chances of finding a 2-cost unit, as it will now be a 25% chance, up from 20%. Overall, what this change does is it makes finding 4-cost champions just a bit harder in the late game, meaning you won't see as many 3-star 4-cost units late game. And one last real quick change to note is that the 5 seconds added to the planning phase have been removed, so be aware that the time between rounds is going to be much shorter. It's time to move on to the trait changes for patch 1020. As we mentioned, the balance design for Set 4 is meant to be smaller tweaks, so all of the traits being nerfed should still remain viable. Up first for the trait changes, we have Cultist. Cultist has been an incredibly powerful early game synergy, especially if you manage to find a chosen cultist. Due to their early game strength, they are nerfing 3 cultists by a small amount by lowering Galio's damage to 125 from 150. Along with that, Galio's health is going down to 1600 from 1800, which means it should be a bit easier to deal with early cultists. Again, don't expect this to be too hard of a nerf. The synergy is still going to be really strong in the early game. Next, we have another early game trait being adjusted, Keeper. Keepers go from being quite good early game to having almost no effect in the mid and late game. The champions are all decent, but the shield just doesn't scale well enough. So to help with their scaling, they've increased the shields of 6 Keeper from 325 up to 400. It may not be enough to help this trait do well past the early game, but it does open up the possibility of playing a mid-game Keeper composition. Mage is receiving a small buff to its 3-piece trait as, well, 3 Mage is relatively underpowered compared to a lot of other synergies. Because the champion's getting lowered spell power when running 3 mages, it's often better not to run it and instead use the champions individually. To help make 3 mages more appealing, they are lowering the spell power reduction to 80% from 70%. Will this be enough to make 3 mage viable? It's hard to say, although running it with Dusk does neutralize the reduced spell power, which means it could be viable to run both together. Other than that, we'll have to wait and see, but the damage reduction of 3 mages still may be too much to bother running it into the mid and late game. Speaking of Dusk, this trait is having a small reduction in the increased spell power when you have 6 of the synergy. It's going from 75 spell power to 70, which is only a 5% change, but the balance history of TFT has shown us that 5% changes can have drastic effects. That said, it shouldn't be too noticeable for 6 Dusk, as the trait is already quite powerful at that tier anyway. Another synergy overperforming in 1019 is Spirit. Spirit kinda came out of nowhere suddenly during the latter half of 1019 to become one of the most commonly played synergies. The attack speed buff it provided, along with Ahri being used as a frontline champion to cast early on in a fight, made it incredibly useful to several compositions. But it definitely has been a bit too good, as Spirit enabled at least 3 meta builds. To help reduce the dependency on Spirit as a trait, they've nerfed Force Spirit to be 80% instead of 90%. This means that there's less of an initial attack speed buff when your Spirit champions cast, and should slow down the scaling of the compositions that utilize the buff. It is still going to be powerful, especially due to Ahri, but hopefully won't be enabling so many builds so easily in 1020. And the last trait being altered is Fortune. There's quite a few alterations that they're doing, but the overall gist of it is that they've increased the gold values of 3 fortune at all intervals from 0 losses up to 9 losses. In addition to that, it is now possible for spatulas to drop from 5 or less losses. 6 fortune is also receiving a general increase to the payout with the average gold value going up. It also won't be possible to only get gold, and there's a very rare jackpot that can happen which will provide a lot of items. Specifics are still vague, but in general, these changes should make fortune slightly more viable. Let's move on now to the champion balance changes. Again, there's a lot of small tweaks, so we'll try to only talk about the relevant buffs and nerfs. Moonlight champions are underperforming slightly early game, so both Diana and Lysandra are receiving buffs to help them. Diana's orbs are being increased to 4, 5, 6, 10 from 3, 4, 6, 10, which isn't much, but it may be enough to make her do better early on. Lysandra is just overall getting increased damage to her early ultimate, with the main and secondary damage being increased. These should help them do better early on in the game, as they already do well enough at tier 3 and 4. Nami is relatively lackluster as far as 1-cost champions go, so they've adjusted the duration of her stun. It's going from 2.53 seconds up to 2.534 seconds. This, along with the 3 mage changes, may make early game mages more feasible. It also may make the mage reroll composition a consistent option when presented with early chosen Nami or Twisted Fate. And the last 1-cost champion being changed is Vayne. Her attack speed is being up to 0.9 from 0.8, which is quite huge considering how we've seen attack speed changes in previous metas have drastic impact on how well a champion does. But Vayne doesn't inherently have any scaling to her attack speed, so you will need a Rage Blade to make her do well as a carry. Annie is up first for the 2-cost champions, as her ability damage and shield are both being increased. The damage is going up to 250, 350, 450 from 200, 300, 450, and her shield is going up to 500, 700, 900 from 400, 600, 900. This should help Annie become a viable early to mid-game option when running either Mage or Fortune, though she won't matter outside of those 2 traits. Aphelios, despite doing well in the mid to late game meta, can suffer a bit early on. To help with that, they've increased his turn duration to 7, 8, 9, 11 from 6, 7, 9, 11. Not too big, but enough to make him, and Moonlight, just a bit stronger without needing a Moonlight chosen. Jax is not necessarily underperforming, but he's not making huge waves in the meta. So to help him out, they've spiced up his attack speed to 0.75 from 0.65, and total mana is now only 100 instead of 125. These are nice adjustments to a champion that is often overlooked. Xin Zhao will now be able to cast much earlier as his mana is down to 30 from 50. In addition, his ability now counts properly as a basic attack, meaning it won't benefit from Hex Tech anymore, and instead, items like Bloodthirster will heal him. More or less quality of life changes for Xin Zhao to make him more appealing to play. Yumi is receiving fairly significant buffs to her 3-star variation. The healing is going up to 75% from 60%, and the attack speed buff is now 60% from 50%. Yumi 3 already felt quite strong, so these buffs should make her even better late game when you get the chance to 3-star her. Next are adjustments to Vygar's targeting, as instead of going after the lowest percentage health, he now targets the champion with the lowest current health. What this means is that he should likely be able to finish off low health units more often and get more ability power stacks. Because of that, they've adjusted his stacking to 4 from 5 at tier 3, and his damage is now 1000, down from 1150. And the largest change of the patch is to Riven, as her scaling at 3 stars has just been way too good. They've lowered the values of her ability damage, shielding, and the wave damage to make her less of an instant win condition when you 3-star her. The shield is now 750 from 1000, and the initial damage each strike does is now also 750 from 1000. And the final attack of her ability, the wave, is going to 1500 damage from 2000. These are all necessary changes, as Riven 3 was way too strong. Shen has definitely been a bit underwhelming, as both Adept and Ninja aren't particularly relevant in the current meta. So to help him be better as a standalone champion, they've lowered his total and starting mana to 5100 from 6125. In addition to that, his shield and taunt duration are going up at tier 3 to 8 seconds from 4. And lastly, to make him a bit tankier, his armor is now 60 from 50. Overall, these are great tweaks to make Shen more appealing as a frontline champion, even if you're only using him for Mystic. Alright, onto the 5-cost legendary champions, starting with Lee Sin. Legendary champions are all doing well enough in the meta, but Lee Sin is definitely not played as much as some of the others, so to make him a better option, they've lowered his total mana to 40 from 50. Sett, on the other hand, has been one of the most dominant 5-cost champions, so they're nerfing him slightly to make his ultimate take a bit longer to cast the second time. The total in starting mana for Sett will now be 70-175 instead of 50-125. Yone has been one of the weaker legendary champions, so to help him out a bit, they've lowered his total mana from 100 to 80. This should help him get his ultimate off earlier to make him have more of an impact on fights. And the last 5-cost champion is Zilean, who will no longer be able to cast his ultimate on himself. This is a great change, as you can now punish Zilean specifically by positioning your champions to try to kill him early on in a fight. That is going to be it for champion changes. We've got one last section to talk about, and that's items. First is a buff to Luden's Echo, as the damage is now 200 from 180. It's a decent buff, but the item is just so irrelevant late game that it may not matter much, although it's certainly more appealing early on. Static Shiv is getting 2 buffs, as the base damage is going up to 85 from 80, and the bonus damage is being adjusted by the same amount. Shiv may become a viable option if there's a lot of emphasis on shields in the meta, but overall it isn't a priority item compared to most of the other DPS items. And the last change for patch 1020 is a nerf to Sunfire Cape. Sunfire has definitely been way too strong early game, so they've lowered how often the effect of the item spreads to 2 seconds from 1. This means it won't spread as often right away in a fight. Ultimately, this may not make much of a difference since early game fights take a long time anyway, and Sunfire is mostly impactful early on in the game. That said, it's potentially going to affect how strong Sunfire is, which is an overall good thing for the early game. That is going to be it for today, folks. The launch patch for Sett 4 was overall a great success, so we're looking forward to seeing how 1020 alters the current meta without disrupting the balance too much. Let us know in the comment section below what you're most excited for with this new patch. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, please be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.